We are so excited tonight. We have two incredible guests, Dr. Brucato, who has been with us before, and Dr. Ann Burgess, the legend herself. And we are so honored that they will both be spending some time with us this evening to talk to us about their experiences and their contributions to the field of criminal psychology and investigation and psychiatric nursing. Dr. Burgess and Dr. Brucato are researchers at Boston College in Massachusetts, where they collaborate on work related to diverse forensic subjects, including the insanity defense, dismemberment and mutilation, asphyxiation and strangulation, murders of Native Americans, castration, and serial killings and sexual assault. They're both members of the Super Sleuth group and on the expert panel for the Cold Case Foundation, working with a large team of other professionals to help law enforcement solve cold cases both nationally and internationally. They're both frequent contributors to the forensic literature and have co-published several articles together. And they have also published books, both of them. Anne has published her book, Killer by Design, and Dr. Brucato, The New Evil. And we are going to give them lots of opportunity to talk about that because we are just dying to hear all of the things that you have to say. So welcome.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
If it's all right with you, Dr. B, I'd like to kind of begin by asking Anne to tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you broke into the FBI to start is what probably most of our viewers are familiar with. What led you there and kind of what your work looks like today?
Sure, happy to. I was a brand new assistant professor over at Boston College when this all started, and I was really mentored in a way by sociologist Linda Lytle Holmstrom, who said that to be an academic, you had to do research and you had to publish. So that really got me started. She was looking for a new topic. She had just finished her dissertation. I had just finished mine. And she mentioned to me the problem of rape, that she said this is going to be a big issue for women. She was going to some of the consciousness raising groups that were being held around the country. And I thought, gee, I didn't know anything about rape in terms of more of a psychoanalytic background. So anyway, I said, if you want to add a counseling component to this project, let's do it. And we did. And the bottom line is we saw 146 people at Boston City Hospital over a 1-year period. And that was every time a rape victim was admitted, they called us. Well, a lot of that was in the middle of the night, and we were still both teaching. So it was a blur of a year. I think I gave all my students A's because I didn't want to have to read any more papers. That was important that it was, we published Rape Trauma Syndrome. That became a very controversial for some paper, but for clinicians, it was wonderful. For Rape Crisis, they finally had something that gave them some idea of the symptoms and problems that women had as a result of being raped. Well, in the meantime, kind of concurrent with this, the FBI Academy, which is their educational arm, was getting a lot of pressure to teach rape investigation because the women's movement was putting pressure on Congress to do something about it, that there's just nothing going on. And so they had to respond. And luckily, they had a new director of the FBI, is William Webster. And he was very visionary, and he was young. He had good ideas. And he said, you guys got to get doing some research. And so there was pressure on those special agents that were teaching. And so Roe Hazelwood got tasked with having to do something on rape investigation. And he happened to call me on the advice of one of his, a detective out in LA. What was interesting is she was a nurse, and she had read one of the first publications that Linda and I had published in the American Journal of Nursing. And long story short, I got invited down. When he invited me, he said, do you want to come down and lecture on rape investigation? And I really hesitated because up to this point, I was talking to people that were very welcoming, women. They were Rape Crisis or they were clinicians. And now I thought, here, I'm going to have to face all these men, and they're not looking at victims. They're, having to face all these or investigate men. But I said, okay. And I told him, I want to see what you're teaching down there. And I thought I would. I said, I'll go down for one time. Well, I can't hurt. I go down, and to get there is oh my gosh, drive and drive and drive. And you get into the woods, and it was getting darker. And I thought, what have I got myself into? But at any rate, it all turned out well. And the important thing to answer your question is they were all having to do their own research. And Bob Ressler was a very kind of very different type of special agent. He liked to do things on his own terms, and he was going out and interviewing criminals in prison because he said, how can I teach it if I haven't talked to them? And he's right, because they didn't talk to criminals, they just investigated. So they would just give information back to the police department. So he said, but he realized that he didn't know how to do it. That they had no training in research. And because I had been down there working on another project with Roy Hazelwood, he kind of said, how about when you finish that one, come on over to my side and help. And I did. And so that's really how it all happened. And when we started it, we had two goals. We had a list of about 80 some serial killers. See, they have to do serial killers. It can't be just one murder, or it usually isn't just one murder. So we had it down to 36. And so my job was to come up with the methodology, which is what I did. And then they went out and got the interviews. We took the data, crunched it down, and came up with the book, Sexual Homicide. That was one part, and we never got to the second part. We never got to writing up the profiling piece. And it was only because of Stephen Constantine at BC, who was very interested in this and started asking me about it. I had all the materials. We had tape recorded everything. And so what my book really goes into is how the agents would go to a crime scene, and from the crime scene come up with age, work, marital status, height, weight, all of that. And it was amazing. And I said, this has to be written up. So the result was A Killer by Design. That's it.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So it was research is what brought you all together. Research, or lack of, trying to establish some groundwork for research for what you had all been doing for years and years, I imagine, and kind of bringing it all together, which is really very cool.
Anne and I started working together back when I was first researching what ultimately became The New Evil, the book I did with Michael Stone. And the idea is I really wanted Anne to do the afterword for the book, which she wound up graciously doing. And then we wound up clicking and collaborating constantly. And I'm so grateful that happened. The book that we did dovetailed very beautifully with Anne's work, because the whole point of the book was that we thought that there was some sort of intersection of culture and what goes on with people that are sort of predisposed to commit serial violence. And, the book is like, this big and loaded with all kinds of different ideas about how that might happen. And the whole thing with Anne's work is that we have to remember that there have always been sexually sadistic people, right? Of course, there's history of that going all the way back to, day one. But it was very unusual prior to like the 1960s in the Western world for people to go out and repetitively kill women with sexual motivation. That's a, believe it or not, pretty recent phenomenon in terms of it happening with such frequency, etc. And so what happened is essentially that law enforcement found themselves thinking, we have to do something about this. Why is there an explosion of serial sexual homicide in the Western world, in the US especially? And where I think Anne's work is so incredibly valuable is that there is nobody in the true crime world, in psychology, forensics, etc., who doesn't understand at this point, I hope, that sexual assault and rape are really about domination and control more than they're about sex, that it's an expression of that. And that's a contribution that I feel really came out of Anne's work, Anne and Linda's work. And I think that really elucidated for the people at the FBI what they needed to be looking at. And the other thing is that I think is enormously important is, and if I remember correctly, you worked with Nick Groth, right?
Yes.
To kind of
Yes.
develop a questionnaire so that there was an organization and a sort of a structure to what these agents were asking these incarcerated serial killers. Because before Anne came on board, it was just a kind of a hodgepodge where there was nothing systematic about it. And so Anne coming on board leads to the creation of this kind of formalized way of interviewing that then, of course, lends itself to data collection and study and then leads to being able to take a statistical approach to crime. When you see that movie, The Sounds of the Lambs, which of course is based on John Douglas's work, you remember the part where Dr. Lecter gets that questionnaire, that gets like slid through. Well, that's completely based on this idea, right? That they kind of got together and created this interview. So, and does that interview still get used? That was put together.
Yes, it still does.
Ah,
Yes. Yeah.
ah, cool.
Well, don't forget we started with 57 pages. And I said, this is really long for these agents to go out and have to do. So maybe we could cut it down. Well, they cut it down to 97 pages. So I never brought that up again. And the other thing on getting them on how to interview, when I said, I listened to one of Bob's interviews and I said, Bob, where are you going with this? And he says, I don't know. He says, I'm just getting him to talk. And that was their thought. Well, I'll just sit down with them and get them to talk. And they did. I mean, these serial killers would love to talk, and especially to an FBI agent. That was big stuff in the prison. But they didn't know what to do. And why should they have? Because they didn't have any courses in statistics or in research or anything.
Right.
So it was a good awakening for all of them, too. And we were able to help some of the others that wanted to do their own other projects.
And there's no question that Anne, your background as a nurse, in forensic nursing, I mean, I think when you were working, for example, with Linda, you were also kind of developing a sensitive way to interview people that had been assaulted. I know that if I remember correctly, I have a pretty strangely photographic memory sometimes, and I seem to remember that you even interviewed someone as young as 3.
Yes, we had
that the age range went all the way down to 3.
Right.
And I think it's easy to take for granted that you were kind of flying the plane while building it.
Yeah.
Right. You were kind of developing it, these sensitive ways and the use of drawings and certain things, that I think is really important. And ultimately that realization that it was more about domination control, that's now household knowledge. Right. About sexual assault and rape and certainly about serial killers. So when you guys got started, it was what, the 70s? It would have been the 70s when you were first
the late 70s. Yeah, it was really the 80s when we got rolling, but the late 70s.
So did that put you in the position, I feel like I'm learning some things too. Did that put you in the position of having transcript from people like Ed Kemper and those kinds of offenders that they were going in and talking to? So you would get the transcript?
Yeah, my job was really to handle all the data. I had my own team up in Boston. We finally got a little bit of money, and they would take the transcripts and type them up. What do you do? Transcribe them. Yeah, transcribe them. So they were in paper form rather than, so you didn't have to just sit and listen, but you certainly could listen to them. So we had the cassette, and we also had the transcript. We also did that with the profiling sessions. We didn't do anything with it at that time, but that was fascinating. And those we still have, is to listen to how they'd all sit around this table and they'd have all these crime scenes out, and they would systematically go back and forth. I think he was this, or I think it was that, and they would then kind of get a consensus. It was really the beginning of a consensus group on what they thought the profile would be. And then that's what would be sent back to the agency that had requested it.
Right. And I think if I remember correctly, it started to transform into this work where you were starting to understand that there were patterns and commonalities across these killers. And that's where a lot of this, again, household kind of textbook knowledge comes from now, that, these individuals tend to have traumatic histories and broken homes and absent fathers and abuse and alcoholism, things like that. And that there's this kind of period of gradually fantasizing about restoring one's ego through domination, control, manipulation, and then ultimately the escalation and the spilling over. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about the kind of classic patterns that your team started to discover about serial killers.
We just kind of followed exactly what you said, the phases of crime. Up until that point, people just say a murder is a murder. Well, it's not. You have a before the murder, you have the murder, and then you have after the murder. So you have phases, if you will, and each phase has its own goal. So we started with growing up to murder. Here were 36 men who grew up in the varying ways they grew up, and they all murdered, and they murdered in different ways. That was one of the first things that the agents were doing. They would go to a crime scene and say whether it was organized or disorganized, and that you have to have a point of reference. And even though there was a lot of backlash over that, it still is used, and it still is very useful to be able to start somewhere. What I brought in, I hoped, and I think it's true, is the whole piece on victimology, because that's all you have usually all you have at a murder is obviously the victim. So what did they know about a victim? They didn't know much about a victim, and that's what I tried to bring them, what we learned from rape victims. And because these turned out to be sexual crimes, it was helpful to have the rape victims who I had talked to, all of them, and say what they had said. So I went back over my interviews with rape victims to see what the phases were, and we tried to kind of match that with what we were seeing from the serial killers. So to answer your question, growing up to murder, what were their backgrounds like? And then the whole act of murder divided down into before, during, and after. And that's where we really got into the fantasy, the development of the thought, whatever you want to call it, that sets into motion the idea. The one thing we're still looking at, and I'm looking at some other cases, is when do they actually decide that they're going to kill? What part or what phase in this process? Because we didn't have that so clearly in the data. But I've had cases, and there are plenty of cases since then, to really look at that, as that's the real nucleus that you want to get at. And that's what gets repeated over and over. Some will have it right from the start, like Ed Kemper. Some will develop it, like Russell. And some will just kind of more impulsively have to do it. That's where, like in a rape victim, where a rape goes bad, as the police will say, and impulsively they kill. Didn't plan to, but felt that was their only way out. So all of those are patterns. That's what we call patterns. And they're different, but they do cluster. And so that's useful when you're looking at a case, like a case like we have now. You've got a bunch of cases out there, and you can look at that and see how many are similar or dissimilar.
Well, I thought, for example, that talking to the victims of rape and sexual assault was really brilliant because it led to the establishment of a typology of rape that you can understand. For example, there's a very big difference between, let's say, a relative that opportunistically assaults someone, or someone who binds a victim and demands that they say things that are scripted or be humiliated, or a victim who is beaten or physically wounded in addition to the sexual assault, or somebody who just has a kind of inferiority thing going on and wants to compensate. So that, I think, again, it's easy to take for granted how that typology had its origins in this work, and going in and actually talking to not only the people perpetrating, but to really get into the mind of a sadist, to have a surviving victim say, this is what they did to me. This is what they were making me say and do. And I think that's where you really start to get into the mind, and I think really ultimately use a criminal's mind against them. Now, one thing, before I want to kind of let everybody jump in here, but one thing that I've always wanted to know is, where did the whole disorganized, organized, mixed typology come from? Who came up with that?
Well, the agents did, because don't forget, they were getting a lot of calls, and they had to come up with something. And Howard Teeton and Pat Mullaney they were the real grandfathers, if you will, of profiling. And they would, after classes, the agents would come in and they'd talk about these cases. And so that's where it developed what's an organized crime. That's where everything is literally organized. I mean, they didn't come up with any fancy terms, but and there were very few clues. They were hard to solve. Those types of characteristics, whereas disorganized, were very easy to prove, because they left a lot of tips and cues and so forth. And it often was because it could have been because they were on drugs or alcohol or substance or something like that. And then they just killed. So we had some of those. We had more organized, though, because they were getting away with it. And if you notice, some of the cases that we were looking at as cold cases, the reason that they're organized is because they got away with it. And it's very hard to find the clues. Even, say, the Gilgo Beach man suspect. It went how many years? 12 years? That's a long time. He almost got away with it if it turns out he's the suspect. And other cases where they've been cold for, they've always said if it goes cold for more than a week, it's you really have lost a lot of ground.
Well, this whole point, and I think the group is certainly going to want to talk about this, but this point about disorganization, organization mixed, it's a big part of the issue that some of us have with Delphi, because the person that is a suspect is someone who is either inflicted with or is feigning, it isn't clear yet, some kind of psychotic, possible, serious disorder where he's presenting as disorganized and eating paper and kind of, breaking the tablet and confessing repeatedly, supposedly on a line, and they can't really link him to the crime scene. And yet you have a crime scene that's organized where there's supposedly movement and staging and everything else. And so I think for people who kind of look at things the way we do, it's very puzzling to try to explain that. And so, I don't know if we want to talk a little bit about Delphi, but I think it so typifies where it would have been good to have people who are like Quantico or somebody, to go in and kind of look at that case. I know John Douglas, you had a peek and felt that it was like a day late and a dollar short in terms of going in. It was way too much time had passed. And but do you guys want to ask Anne a little bit about Delphi? I don't know anyone who knows more about it. One of the things to come out of this work that was done, originally by people like John Douglas, Hazelwood, Ressler, and is really the realization that there are subtypes of serial killers, right? Now, first of all, as I have said previously, but for the sake of the audience, I'll say very quickly, is that there's been a pretty significant change to the FBI definition of serial killing, which I think is problematic personally. But the original conceptualization was that there were three victims separated in time by what's called a cooling off period, right? A period where the person kind of breaks. This is not a spree killer that goes out and repetitively kills with no pause, right, in multiple places. And certainly not a mass murderer who kills people all in the same place at the same time, right? The number depends upon one's definition. The FBI says four, and crime classification manual says four victims for mass murder. I use three, but four is a more conservative number. But for a serial killer, it used to be three, separated in time with cooling off period. And this was the key, that the killing was done in the service of abnormal gratification, abnormal psychological gratification. New definition simply says you have to kill two people separated in time by cooling off period. That's it. And so there are people being called serial killers that are like robbers that kill the witnesses and things like that. But when we think of a serial killer, we're talking about, I mean, I think, Anne, you'd agree, we're talking about people who are doing this because of fantasy life and psychological gratification. And so there are really four basic subtypes, right? So the first, and I'll do them in order of rarity to the most common. So the first would be mothers who repeatedly kill their own children, right? And usually about a year apart, if you look at the literature. And that has a lot to do with the attention that they will get, like at the funeral and from other people and so forth. So this kind of idea like, I lost the child, I was a nobody, now I'm a somebody, I get hooked on it. And there's this kind of, the second is what are called angels of death. And these are nurses and doctors who kill their charges, essentially, right? And they kind of divvy up into people who do it because of the godlike feeling that they get, sort of arbitrating life and death. Or it has to do with like wanting to be the one that runs on the scene when chaos is happening, so you look like a hero. And there are lots of really interesting cases of that. One of the most fascinating things about angels of death is they seem to have the highest victim counts. There are angel of death killers that have killed like over 100 people. It's very narcissistic, right? It's very, and sometimes the killing can be profoundly cruel. The ways that angel of death killers will kill you, right? I mean, it could be something as simple as, injecting with very high amounts of morphine or something, right? But it could also be very cruel, right? Like Donald Harvey, the nurse who was killing people. John wrote about him recently in The Killer Across the Table, who would do things like snake a coat hanger into a catheter to intentionally puncture someone and cause infection.
Oh my
And then
God.
someone would get ill, and then he would look like a hero for being the person taking care of the right. So there's that kind of killer. Then you get, and these are kind of unusual, you get people who are misanthropes that hate a certain group or are on a mission, like Ted Kaczynski or the Zodiac killer, or in many ways, Son of Sam, right? Who are kind of, they're not really, I mean, there could be a sexual component, but that's not primary. And it's all about like, there's a group I despise and I want to kind of get even with them. And then finally, you have the largest pool, which is men who commit, usually men, serial sexual homicide. And that's the group I think we're going to be talking about the most. And serial sexual homicide is all about people who are using sex after puberty as an expression of long-standing anger towards some person or group that they feel have hurt them, and then kind of fantasizing about leveling the playing field and then doing so with a pretty incredible process of stalking. And then maybe you could talk a little bit about, maybe we'll get to Delphi and everything later, but maybe you could talk a little bit to the group about the other kinds of offenses that the work revealed that a lot of these people are doing well before they kill.
Well, I think the category that's most important are what are called the paraphilias, the fetishes that are often precursors, as Gary has said. That I remember one of the, it was Kemper, one that would just at night go walking around the neighborhood. And a lot of people don't put their blinds down. And so he had a lot of opportunity to look in and see women undressing or whatever. That I think escalated. Then you get into the it's not just the peeping kind of thing, but the having a fetish for a certain type of clothing or leather, things like that. And we found that sadists often had multiple fetishes. And one of the things we learned early, I was always interested in what they were wearing under their clothes, because they may have on the underwear from one of the victims and that so carries it with him all the time and uses it and can get the arousal from that when he goes out. So all of these things are things that you don't think about. I remember one case where he tried to say that on dismemberment that didn't admit to anything. And yet, luckily, the medical examiner had put in his autopsy report that all the fingernails were gone on the victim. So that could be said during the interview. And what did you do with the fingernails to try to break through some of this denial? Because that was real evidence that they had that he had done that. And obviously that was certainly a torturous act that was committed on that woman. Whether it was alive or not, I can't remember. But still, those are some of the things that the agents would use to get the interviews to really cut through all of the denial and so forth that they had. But I think, Gary, what you're talking about on classification, we came up with 4 categories that we put them into, whether it was a criminal enterprise, which is where money is involved. There's your assassins or your hiring thing. And of course, we weren't interested in that for the book. But then the personal cause was what we really were interested in, is what was the psychological reason for the offender killing. And that's where we had I think we had 8 or 10 actual categories. Then there was the sexual homicide, of course. And that started out because there was a very good documentary that was called No Apparent Motive. And that's really at the beginning of when the agents were talking out about the profiling. And that was such a good case. And they had Kemper in it. They had Russell. They had a number of the serial killers that we had studied in that. Then the fourth was, which is very hard to get, was the group cause, where multiple people would get together to kill. And I don't know how many would be multiple in a sexual homicide, but certainly you can have dual. You can have two. And one other thing on the big hassle they had over whether it's two or three that qualify as a serial. There was a very famous conference that they had down in Texas, in San Antonio, Texas, where they really worked over that issue. And it became, I think, more of a political issue of whether it meant two or three. The agents wanted to keep it at three. I wanted to keep it at three, but there was a lot of pressure from non-agents and non-law enforcement to put it at two. I don't know whether that meant statistics would go up or what, but anyway. Well, there's always a backstory to any of these things that happen. I don't know if I answered your question, Gary.
But that definition change is a problem, because now the statistics are sort of warped, because they're mingling in people that are serial killers that have no sexual motivation at all, that aren't anything like what we're talking about. And then you wind up with very different profiles based on statistics. And so I'm a really big believer that if you're going to collect a large data set on serial killers, they have to be subtyped. They shouldn't be pooled simply because of the number of people they've killed. That's very strange to me. But I think Simonis comes to mind. The Simonis case, which John Simonis, you wrote about, Killer by Design, comes to mind as a really good case to kind of talk about this escalation process, and somebody that didn't quite go over the edge into killing, but I think had been thinking about it. Because as you write about in the book, I mean, if he had been given enough time, he probably would have gone on and killed. So he's like the perfect example of somebody that's just at that crossroad.
Right.
And so maybe, I don't know, I mean, if you guys are familiar with the Simonis case, maybe Ann can summarize it a little bit.
And he did something very right. They convicted someone else for a lot of these crimes, and he never said anything. And when they finally got him, the one that poor guy that had been convicted for it said to him, "Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you say something?" And he said, "I wasn't going to give myself up." So the narcissism, I mean, is so clear. And that has happened on other cases where somebody else on these serial, you got to be careful that somebody else doesn't get the conviction when, you want to be really, really sure. But anyway, Barry John Simonis was a very interesting with his background. He was an athlete in high school, played football, good-looking guy, and went into the service. And so we always suspected there were a lot of victims over because he went overseas. That probably is where he really got into some of his rape behavior. And he did admit to doing telephone calls. He would do scary calls to victims on the telephone, make obscene, I guess it would be called in those days, obscene phone calls. And he did the peeping. One of the background things, because he was so visual, and one of his techniques was really, talk about torturous. He would get a victim and he would rape her in front of her husband or children. So that whole idea of needing the audience and what that meant to him, as I dug around in his background, there was a good suspicion that his father had incested the sister. And if that is true, he might well have witnessed that, peeked at it, whatever you want to call it, in a more secretive way. And that might have started way back then as a possible nucleus of the intent. But he would, as it escalated, he clearly escalated. He very well planned it. He had cut pieces of binds that he would take it in. He had his rape kit. And he also would travel the back road so that he knew that they would be looking for him. So he, again, took the back roads. He cut telephone wires going in. He was so brutal. And I remember I talked to a number of the victims. And in one case, he would even lift the victim up by her breasts. And that, you can imagine how painful that was. He ended up having to have a double mastectomy. He was so brutal to her breasts. So all of these little things that fell in there, I always thought it was very interesting the way he was caught. And it's a way that the police are very good at. They don't talk about this too much, but they caught him. Anyone, do you know how they caught him? It wasn't from any great psychological profile that the agents did. It was his car. And police always ask, do you have seen, they ask two things. One, have you had any unusual phone calls recently? Meaning, has anyone been checking up on you or your home, etc.? And have you noticed any unusual cars in the neighborhood? And the women had. And his car fit his personality. I always give that as an exam question of what kind of a car would John some of us drive. Anyone want to guess, or do you know? Anyway, he's very narcissistic, very out there, very ego, So what kind of car is he going to drive? Is he going to drive like a police car, a dark navy blue car with, the very
big and flashy? I think.
I'll guess a Corvette.
Yeah, you got it. A red Corvette.
Really?
Yeah. I know I'm driving a red Trans Am.
I didn't Google it, I promise.
Yeah. A red Trans Am, and only got it. He was building up to having multiple victims, and this one, he had left the car somewhere and taken the victim's car, and they had remembered it. Two people, I guess, had remembered it. It was very easy to run a license number on that, and that's how they got him. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so some of the important things that we learned a lot from him. I know we didn't get any homicides, but I would be willing that he had killed. I really do think that he had killed, and but they'll never give up unless they think you have the evidence. So you always have to have evidence for that. But he had over, I think, 50 or 60 victims. He traveled in 12 different states. He loved to travel. He started out just robbing like stereos and things, but it was hard to fence that and to get the money. So then he started going for cash and things like that. But if they hadn't caught him, I know that he would have had to escalate. It's a good example.
Well, I think he kept going in. I mean, you just keep hearing more and more stories about people they realize, I think, were Simone. It's sort of, I think they're up to, if I remember correctly, it's like 81 victims and 130 home invasions, as of the last time and I don't know how many of those they knew about at the time. But one of the things I remember finding very interesting about him was, the ski mask.
Yeah, he wore a ski mask.
And
right.
He always wore a ski mask. And what I found interesting about it is, because that gets right into the way I like to think about cases, and that Ann and I often talk about, is who is the mask for? I mean, is the mask so that other people don't recognize you? Or is it that if you were you wouldn't feel powerful enough to do this, that you have to become someone else? Also, there are a lot of shades of Dennis Rader in the Simonis case. You almost wonder who studied whom. But, the cutting of phone wires, the home invasions, the figuring out how to inveigle yourself into the house through, houses that had certain kinds of windows and back entrances and things, and, garages you can enter through. And I think you really have to start out as like a master burglar before a lot of these guys start out that way, right?
I find myself drawn to knife cases all the time. The ones I feel, and it wasn't that I sought them out, but the ones I noticed I consistently obsessed over and couldn't get out of my head were the knife murders. And over time, I realized I developed really strong feelings about them. I just thought they were a completely different league than gun murders, for example.
Sure. Yeah. No, and that would be a good research question too. We just finished a paper on, did it matter if in strangulation cases, whether it was manual or ligature, and separated them out that way. But I think that you could do a similar study on blade cases and see whether it mattered where the injury was focused, or, come up with various questions and look at about 200 cases that way.
There is this kind of weird attachment to the blade where it's almost, I hate to say it, I mean, not to sound lewd or anything, but it's sort of the way that men sometimes talk about their penis, right? The idea is that they sometimes name it. It has a special place. They think it's a symbol of power. That's why it's so difficult for me to believe, and I don't know how you feel about this, Ann. It's very difficult for me to think that Kohberger got rid of that blade if he was the assailant. I just can't imagine it.
I thought we decided that he didn't. We don't think he did. I don't think he did. unless unless in the frenzy of being arrested.
And there is that process of bonding with it. Greg Cooper talks about that, using
Yes.
it, let's say, to kill animals and practice with it and hold it in the hand and kind of wear it in the mirror when you're rehearsing. Well, sometimes even going into the house where you're later going to kill people, they're sleeping or you're prowling around and you've got it on or with you,
He was a
which is
vegan, right?
disturbing. But
Yes, you're right.
yes,
And he saved
right.
the dog.
Yeah.
Yes, I never thought that was a coincidence. I always thought that he
I
seemed
too.
like somebody that was where predictability of relationships was the key to the whole thing.
Yes.
And so as a consequence, I think he probably liked animals more than people. And I'm not surprised he didn't kill the dog. I really am not. There's something about the predictability of them I could see appealing to somebody like him. I have no idea. I only know that if he is guilty, what's fascinating is the observation by other people that he kind of had a spring in his step after this happened, that he had had a period of dysphoria, nastiness, control issues. Then this happens, and in the period right after, he's like, and that's really interesting to think about in terms of what kind of release was that. It obviously made him feel some kind of power release, or and this is where people, like Ann and me, I think, get interested in this as academics.
I also like to know what his papers were, what he wrote about. All of those things, I'm sure, will come out.
If he is guilty, I find a kind of a somberness about that case, because he was such a bright guy that if he had been sort of twisted in the right direction and not felt so outcasted and so weird, it might have meant something to him. It might have pushed him in a more pro-social direction.
I need to be convinced of how bright he was. I need to see some of his
Oh,
papers.
people say he was quite bright. I mean, multiple academics that worked with him said he was one of their brightest students.
Time will tell.
Maybe it was just what they said in reference letters.
I'm drowning in Post-its because every time we do these great talks, I just listen and listen, and then I'm missing. I'm just drowning in Post-its of my notes. But some of our guests have asked some really great questions, so I've been making a point to star those. Would it be okay if I asked a few of them?
Of course. Yeah, I see one of your chats that he had lost his teaching position at the university just before the crime. So thank you, Secret Diva.
There's so much we don't know because everybody's gagged.
Yeah, and it's going to be hard when they present at the trial, because if he's taking the position that he's just riding around, he's going to deny everything. You're not going to get anything, even from some of the, although I think of that survey.
And remember, there were a lot of questions that were sort of tapping psychopathy. Like, if you went to a party and you spilled red wine on the carpet, would you tell the host, or would you kind of hide it with the furniture? Things like that.
Someone
red wine.
did that. Wait a minute. Someone did that. Was it the BTK killer?
I think you're thinking of the incident
in
BTK's life where at the dinner table there was a spilling of pasta and the sauce went all over, and he got kind of activated. And I had said to Carrie Rawson in an interview, maybe it reminded him of blood, because he got so activated that he started to strangle her brother.
Yeah.
And she got a glimpse of BTK, right there at the dinner table. So what are some of these Post-its you've got that you're amassing there?
Yes. Well, so one is, are there many female sexual sadists? What's their malfunction? What do they have going on that might be different from men?
Yeah, testosterone. That's your number one drug killer in the country.
I'm putting that on a shirt.
Yeah.
Well, you're eight times more likely to kill if you. There have been a smattering of female sexual sadists, but they are extremely rare. They're as rare as hen's teeth, as the old saying says. And there was certainly Eileen Wuornos, a more contemporary example. But the interesting thing about them is that they all seemed to be people who had been abused. They seemed to be women who were angry at men, not because they wanted to express domination or control through sex. It was more like using sex as a way to kind of lure someone to your bed and then enact a fantasy of killing the person who assaulted you once. So it's a kind of little different. And the other thing is, generally speaking, I mean, Anne, I don't know if you would echo this from your own work, from what I have put together from the research is that it looks like men generally like to hunt and kill strangers, and women are more likely to kill intimates. And it looks like men like to use weapons that require a little bit of closeness, and the women like to use weapons that require more distance, like poisons and things like that. And does that jive with your own sense of
Yeah,
things?
that matches, right. I have a PowerPoint with about 20 little faces of women, but and you've hit most of the key ones,
Yeah,
but it's
rare.
so
Yeah.
rare. It's so rare. Yeah, and I do think that there's a physiology to it. A testosterone is known to give power and dominance and aggression, and you can't have a murder without having rage and anger. So that kind of all fits.
And testosterone is related to left hemisphere dominance, which is of course a
Oh,
very visual,
yeah,
spatial, kind of technological brain area, I mean, in terms
yeah,
of, as opposed to the more emotional, warm and fuzzy right hemisphere, so it shouldn't be surprising that when we deal with true psychopaths, right, who make up the vast majority of serial killers, that they're highly visual, that it's not surprising that they have a need for visual fantasy, that they think like a hunter. I mean, there have been offenders that have flat out said, I pictured that house in my mind and I still can 30 years later. There was a flower over here in a pot, that's where there was a red door. They had this kind of object on the dresser, and even the putting the crime scene together, it posing and all that, is a big part of the ritual. It's a big part of that's where, you get into this point that again really comes out of this work that Anne's group did, that now is household knowledge in the true crime world, is this notion of a signature. And Anne, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about signature elements.
yeah. Signature is important. I think Douglas was one of the first that brought it up. And the MO can change. They change their MO to improve themselves, how they kill and how they get away with it. And they get very good at it. Obviously, all the cold cases that we hear about. But the signature has the nucleus of the psychological issue, and that's where that is so important if you trying to understand them and you want to get to that they have to do it in a certain way. And John usually says that it's the way they will bind someone. They have a certain way they do it. I think John Joubert, he only had 2 victims. Well, no, he really had 3 victims, and it was bondage and tying up and so forth. So signature is important, and you try to look for that in serial cases.
Well, this comes up lately in the Horman case, or Huraman, as I think he pronounces it. And what's interesting about that is, they're trying to tie these other bodies that have been found to the same offender that, is being accused of. What's complicated about it is that those victims are bound in a highly specific way and put in the burlap and
Yeah.
left out, and it feels very ritualistic. And it raises the question of what aspects of that are signature. And then what's happening lately that, Ann and I were just talking about this elsewhere, what's really, really interesting is that you're getting this smattering of women who went out on dates with him, and he didn't ultimately, if
Yeah.
he's the killer, he didn't kill them. And it's giving us this snapshot of this kind of ritualistic series of things he would say and what he liked to do and so forth. But my sense has been that he needed the victim to consent a little bit to some rough sex or whatever, by sort of testing if she was put off by him talking about serial killers and strangulation and things like that.
Sure.
And it's really interesting to think about it. But I think right now we don't have enough evidence. But
No.
it might be because we can talk, Ann, about what we found out about dismemberment, about why offenders do it, because it gives a clue of why somebody might change their MO. Maybe it wasn't a signature element. Maybe it was just to get rid of evidence, or
Someone asked a great question
yeah,
about
yeah.
Rex earlier, and then I want to add in my own part too. So they
Sure.
asked,
Please do. This is
they asked if
Yeah.
you had the chance to go interview him or evaluate him, how would you approach that? What would you say? And my part too is, how would that differ from how you might approach Richard Allen?
Oh, I think you approach each one of them very separately. You have to know as much, and the agents did this. They got all the information they possibly could before they would go in to interview them. So it depends on how much information you had. And then you want to try to find the hook, where can you get his defenses down, so to speak.
Where would you get his defenses down?
Which one? On who?
Rex.
Oh, on Huerman. What do we know about him? He's an architect. He was married twice. He's got a child. So there's a family issue there. And that might be the way to get started talking. Certainly you never start off, well, why did you do it? Or something like that. Not very direct. You sneak up on them. So kind of get in this way. And it must have been hard on your family to have the situation. In other words, stay away from him first and then move towards him. Is what I would suggest. So you start with the family. How are they doing? What was your reaction when they arrested you? That kind of approach. And then what does he know about his family? Does he miss that he hasn't seen them? I would do it that way rather than any specific questions, and just see how much and then you would feed on what he says. You would play back what he would say to you. Gary, how are you going to interview him?
When I talk to people of this ilk, one of the things I try to do is not make it clear to them that I have them kind of figured out. In other words, I don't want to come across that I'm very bright. I also think that for this kind of offender, he is so visual and is going to get so excited talking about certain things that if you drop little breadcrumbs to draw him into a certain topic, I think you would see even a physiological change and almost a boastfulness, because the women on the dates said that when he started talking about Gilgo, he became different, visually different. He would go into almost a trance-like, excited state of remembering. And I think we would see that. The other thing I really would want to talk to him about is I am absolutely compelled by the notion that for him, everything is tied to the death of his father, which I think was very traumatic for him. It is not a surprise for me, for example, that he told one of these women on a date that he was fascinated by the Hillside Stranglers. Kenneth Bianchi had traumatically lost his father and essentially denied it. And his whole, a lot of his crimes were tied to that idea. But I think the death of his father was very significant because it left him with a mother that he had apparently very mixed feelings about, right? And this is not surprising because we have somebody who marries a nurse that's gentle and kind and goes out and kills women that he thinks are wanton or whatever that he feels about them. So I think there is that fragmentation. And so for me, I would want to sort of trigger by mentioning women and saying what he says. Just kind of talking about women. And but the idea is to kind of get him comfortable enough that he gets on the subject and then slips into it. Because I think once he'd get on a roll, I don't think he could hide it. And if you activated that guy and got under the mask, I don't think he had that much control. I mean, he had a history of not being able to hide his sadism, his anger, and nastiness, his etc. It was pouring out at work and to his neighbors and all that. So I mean, that's
one strategy to get him to break in terms of getting him angry. What would get him angry?
Right.
What would get him that would be
lose control.
Lose control. Yeah.
And you've raised we've talked about this. A point you raised that I thought was really important is that he may have been disciplined by his father in a corporal way. I mean, the belt found on one of the victims was his father's.
Well, that secret diva came through again. She said, I bet his father belted him. We've got some things coming through. She also says, or his school friend said that it was well known that he had conflicts with his father at home. So all of that is, that's interesting that your audience has a lot of information on this. They're going to solve it, right? They're going to go to the courtroom, huh?
They probably will.
Never know. You never know. But it makes me wonder how many of these kinds of shows these killers watch. I wouldn't be surprised if Foreman is guilty. I wouldn't be surprised if he was watching podcasts and things like this.
Yeah.
Did you guys want to talk a little bit about Delphi while we have Ann? Because I
Always.
raised it before and your
We
audience
always-
was salivating, and then we kind of put them off.
Yeah, we always want to talk about Delphi.
Well, somebody else had a great question earlier, and I think we've discussed it a little bit on some of the past episodes, but I'd love to hear Ann's take on it as well. It seems the Delphi murders were a very high risk murder. 2 victims, middle of the day on a Monday in a remote but public place where plenty of people were around, driving around. A very high risk crime, knife murder. A lot of things could have gone wrong. Does it jive that the person who has been arrested for this crime has no documented criminal history?
Yeah, I think that's very worrying in terms of, do they have the right guy? I agree that he doesn't have any history. He's married. He's got children. So he's what we call high. So if it's him, it's high social competence. And the evidence, and they've got to have more evidence than what they say, that there's a bullet that they found. Well, that bullet could have been there in a number of ways. So, and I think if there was a gun used, and I have no doubt that it was used to threaten the girls to say, get down here, because why else would they go from this bridge area all the way down if they weren't threatened to it? Unless somebody was up there and pushed them down. We don't know, unfortunately, except for the little video or the one girl made. So there's that. And then somebody knew the area very well, had to have. A lot of it doesn't add up. I know that I looked at that, and I think it's going to be very interesting if they do go to trial on him. It doesn't look like, from what Gary says, that, or some of the things we said about his mental status, that it might not work. He probably needs a competency exam, or has he had one? I don't know that.
Not that I mean, there was an assessment for related to meds, and it was done by the Department of Corrections professionals. And but the whole thing is, what's complicated about it is that because of the way that it was hyped in the media, played up in the media, that you had someone who made a confession. That seems to people like a no-brainer, that if somebody confesses, they did it. But what's complicated about it is that for anyone in this business, we know that there are a lot of reasons why people confess that didn't do it, especially if there's mental illness involved. And there are things that I just think are logical points that I hope will be made to a jury. Like, for example, people who are misogynistic and would kill 2 females in that manner would not be on a phone intimately confessing to their mother and their wife that they confide in and love, that they are guilty of a crime. That doesn't match. You would hate those people. So you wouldn't have a loving, adoring relationship unless you were one of these splitters, like we think might be going on with Hoyerman or whatever. But it's odd. Also odd is it's a recorded line. It says it's a recorded line. Why would you repeatedly do it? Wouldn't you remember that you already said it? Then there's all that kind of disorganized behavior.
Well, I'm just going to say the false confession it's well known that a lot of people are coerced into making a false confession. There's one, Kathleen Zellner out of Illinois has done about 13 cases now of false confessions. I did a couple with her, and it's hard. But now they had DNA that didn't match. So that's usually, I don't know whether they have DNA on this one.
The problem is that let's say anybody had been seriously considering the landowner, Ron Logan.
Right.
Part of the problem is that the whole place would be teeming with his DNA. Any DNA that you found, you would say, "Buddy lives here." So what does it mean?
Found on the victim.
Kind of problem.
No, I mean, if it was found on the victim.
Well, that's another story.
I want to see the crime scenes and see what they have, and the ME's report. When is it going to trial? Do we know? Oh, January.
Theoretically.
Okay.
Bless you.
Excuse me, my immortalized sneezes. But it's interesting because if you look at the video of Bridge Guy, the person's older. And what's odd about this is, the kind of crime that was committed there is not typical of somebody that's where it's like what they call a one and done. It's more typical of somebody that would have done this sequentially for years, because it's a sexualized kind of offense. Also, it's very bold. 2 victims at once.
Yeah.
you know, in broad daylight, you know, etc. I mean, it seems like somebody who knew that area very well and was rehearsed and so forth. And it doesn't match the disorganized kind of thing you would expect to see in somebody with mental illness. So that with Alan, the question is he malingering or does he have a history of mental illness? And we won't know without an assessment. I think we have to be kind of open to whatever we find out. But until we know, I mean,
well, taking two victims, especially, well, they're young, they're 12 and 13, so that's a disadvantage for a victim. They're more high risk at that age. But unless you have like a gun or something to control them, it's very hard to control two teenagers. Right. You have to raise the question, could have been two of them. But if there were two of them, you'd probably get one. That's hard, but we'd certainly have pairs, a few cases where there have been pairs. Hillside Stranglers, for one. They did it in pairs. Kemper always generally had two victims, but he also had a gun.
It's interesting that I have become convinced, partly because these guys really know Delphi and talk about it like the Energizer bunnies, you know, that spew Delphi day and night. And I've learned a great deal. And I have become convinced that Libby was really secondary in the killer's eyes because of things that I have kind of patched together with them and elsewhere. I think it's going to emerge that Abby was really the center of this crime, but I don't believe there was rape. It was just a sexualized killing, and you know, and I think there was some aspect of wanting to humiliate women through this offense. I've always been fascinated by the idea that they were found on Valentine's Day. And one of the hypotheses that we've talked about is the notion that this offender had been jilted or wounded by a woman, and this had the extra element of kind of punishing her or sending a message or expressing some hostility towards a woman. And I think that's something that is, you know, it doesn't seem to be present in the Allen story. You know, that's the other thing. Like, it just doesn't match. He doesn't have the history of a sexual sadist. He doesn't have a history of killing anybody before, certainly not sexually. He doesn't have a history of any of that.
Yeah, it's a high risk time that they do this. It's the middle of the day.
I think people just want it to be over. Everyone wants their monster. And if somebody's arrested, they're going to find a way to make him their monster, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense on paper. Perhaps he is, and we just haven't seen it yet.
Part of what's very troubling, Courtney, is that something will come out in the press, and then when it's sort of corrected, it doesn't get as much attention, and now you have a narrative that lingers in the press. Right. So, like, if you ask people in the true crime community, like, you know, about this bullet, they'll say, well, I remember that it was found to come from his gun. And it's a gun that's like commonly used by law enforcement, right? I mean, it could have been dropped when they were like investigating the scene or something, you know. That's a very big difference and a major, even though it looks like a trifle, it's a huge thing. Yeah. And there's nothing to tie him. I mean, it doesn't look like there's anything to tie, you know. But so the other question, of course, is, can this guy testify? I mean, it's like if he gets up and testifies and he's anything like he sounds, he's going to look like a pretty sympathetic. I mean, they're going to feel sorry for him. He looks very ill and weak and muttering or whatever he's doing.
What's he going to say about why he confessed, though, Gary? What's he going to say why he confessed? That's where they'll try to get him.
Who knows? But I've had patients with delusions of guilt that will confess to things. But I mean, I've had patients in their 20s say that they were responsible for the Holocaust. Yeah. I mean, you know, delusions of guilt are a real thing. But I guess the point Ann and I are trying to make is we can't say one way or the other what's going on here, obviously. But the guy that is in custody does not match the profile of what you would expect in this case. That's I guess what, and that's really puzzling.
Yep,
that's true.
I think we've got to be, as I always say, agnostic.
Even the age in the Huerman, he was older, wasn't he? In his 40s?
Yeah, when he was doing
for it to be a first. I mean, that's the important thing, for it to be a first, but certainly older than it was Blade, right? Mm-hmm. For both of the girls. Yeah.
Even Alan would be on the older side for this.
Right. How old would he have been at the time? 5-6 years ago. What is he now?
He would have been
late 40s.
Late 40s, yeah. It's so unusual.
Right.
And it's really hard when you don't have the crime scene. You don't have the,
Right.
you don't have a lot of information. It's really tough.
But there are odd things about that case. There really are.
Yeah.
But it would have been helpful if
I
they had
agree.
people go in and profile it from day one,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, that would
And
have been
because
so
that killer
cool.
almost certainly was from a very
Yep.
small radius, and they could have used some proactive techniques or maybe a public event where people come and kind of give ideas about the case. I mean, it's such a small town. I mean, it's
Right.
I don't think it would have been too difficult, but I know that John Douglas really bemoaned that they waited too long
Too long. Yeah.
in that case. I guess just in the interest of time, should we take some questions or
Sure.
just to kind
Yeah.
of move toward
Yeah. Oh my
wrapping
God.
up? What do you guys think? Are you all right with us maybe
Please.
opening up to questions?
Yes,
Absolutely.
there's been a lot of great ones. If somebody wants to,
Fire away. Yeah, and I think a very rich conversation. Well, let's see. Anything?
Can I
Not
make
all
a
at once.
comment? Because I'll forget. Dr. Ann, I was kind of revisiting your testimony from the Menendez case, just for fun. You said something that was actually very helpful for me when you were being questioned kind of by the prosecutor. She asked about, you were talking about disorganized versus organized. And
Right.
the way that you described it at one point was very simple. The reason that we classify these crime scenes is so that you can find the person who did it quickly.
Right.
And
That's the point.
I had never, so simple and it's so obvious, and I had never thought of it laid out that obviously, I guess. We always think of profiling as this kind of abstract, and it serves a very practical purpose, though, and that was helpful for me to hear.
Well, that's good because that's why the agents did it. They had to get as fast as they could, and that was the simplest way for them to start their thinking. It just is a starting point, if you will, because the psychological piece is very interesting, but that doesn't help you find someone. You can't find somebody that's antisocial or that's, as John used to say, has an Oedipus complex. So it is hard. But now in the Menendez case, they were organized, and they were disorganized. I didn't think that they had planned it. They had an alibi, but it sure didn't work. And they're amateurs, very much young. The police should have said when they said they walked into the house and they smelled smoke, gun smoke. Gun smoke dissipates so quickly. They had been away. Remember, they had gone to this movie, and they had said they had gone away. So they should have said right there, let's test your hands. They're very quick to put and find out if you, unless they had washed their hands, which I don't think they had. So I think the police dropped the ball. They were so overwhelmed by this. These two this very well-known person.
They were in shock almost. They were just kind of.
Oh, and it was hard. Yeah, it was brutal. Talk about bloody. It was very bloody shooting because they used shotguns. My lands, they didn't even. Can you imagine? Terrible.
Dan, that case is interesting in terms of the way that Michael Stone and I think about cases, because there is a category very low on the scale, category 5, which is for people who are not necessarily people that would ever kill again, but are essentially angry at someone who has abused them or taken advantage of them, and then act out to eliminate that person. And usually there's such an explosion of wanting to express upset toward that person that the crime could be profoundly vicious or blood everywhere or whatever, because it shows how much emotion there is in this traumatized individual. If there was any truth to the trauma idea with the Menendez case, I thought it was that kind of case. And for Michael and me, cases that are low on the scale, it predicts not offending again. If those people if they were out in the world, I don't think that they would kill again. It has to do with the circumstances. That's very different than an offender who's motivated by personality and fantasy that will never stop. It's and I don't know if you agree with that assessment, but that's my sense, is that it was secondary to abuse.
Oh, I do. Yeah, I do. And that's why even for them to have given a sentence with no provision for parole was so wrong. It really was wrong. They can have provision for parole after 20 years or whatever. I mean, they've been in there 32 years and no provision. That was all orchestrated by the judge. He was very angry from the first that they got a hung jury the first time.
But what's interesting about those cases, especially when females are involved, is that they can even evoke sympathy from the general public. Like, for example, there are cases where, let's say, a female has been sexually assaulted by her father, so she kills him, and there can be sympathy.
Sure.
There's a case, for example, a case in Russia, I think it is, of three sisters that were systematically sexually assaulted by their father. And so they plotted that one would hold a pillow over his head and the other two beat him with a hammer to death. And there are demands from the public that those women be released, that they're heroes that stood up to an abusive father. That gets very confusing for the general public, that kind of thing. And you saw that also with the recent release of Leslie Van Houten from the Manson family, that the general public kind of forgets that she was like the youngest member of the family. She was lured away from a family to join this cult. She's probably being beaten and sexually assaulted by Charlie, and then as a kind of initiation ritual, she's demanded by Charlie that she goes into the LaBianca home and, quote, do something witchy. So she waits until Rosemary LaBianca is already dead and then stabs her so she could say she did something. And then as soon as you take her out of the family and she's not scared anymore and she's in jail, she turns her whole life around and becomes like a victims' rights advocate and helps people through therapy groups and get out of cults. And people are angry that she was a member of the Manson family and she's a vicious person and whatever. But to me, Leslie Van Houten, who we would place it very low on the scale, is really in many ways a victim herself, who perpetrated in the context of kind of what was happening to her. And I think if you have like an unsophisticated way of thinking, you just think if you kill, you're evil. If but there are all kinds of stories about what lead to people doing these things. And I think she's complicated. This is not a vicious psychopath. It's a very complicated person. What are the questions that are coming up here?
So there's one from Hoosier, who is a friend of ours, who says, for Dr. Burgess, do you think there could have been any good technique applied early on to kind of smoke? And I imagine he means in the Delphi case.
Right. Well, yes. I mean, that's the whole purpose of getting on an investigation as quickly as you can and get evidence. You've got to get the evidence. Nowadays, they're not going to, I'm surprised they're going after, unless they've got evidence on this Richard Allen, that it's very hard. You can't just do circumstantial. So the way it's done, and you've got to get experts in. If you've got a police department that's young or rural or not well educated, you've got to call in. And the FBI is always willing to go in, but then you get into the issue of egos, and they don't want it. It's our case, we're going to solve it. So you have to be careful with that. So I'd agree with you. We just got to get in there early and get people that know what they're doing.
I think, and they probably would have used one of those classic techniques where you have those kind of gatherings where you say to the public, like, do you have any thoughts on the case? Do you whatever? And you kind of get the killer to go, because you know that whoever did this would have been monitoring everything.
Yeah.
And been very interested.
Yeah, he lived there for 12 years. He held a steady job working for CBS. I mean, by all accounts, it's a corporate job. You're working for a large corporation. He held a steady job there for 12 years. He never left town. He never tried to change anything about himself.
Psychopathy starts when you're a little kid. You don't become a psychopath older. You should see a pattern going all the way back.
Right.
In fact, that's why antisocial personality disorder, as it is unfortunately termed in the DSM-5, they have to have this conduct disorder and component to explain that, unlike other personality disorders, it goes all the way back to when you're a little kid. So you get diagnosed with that first to capture the juvenile delinquency and other kind of things that would be present. The only place I have seen someone become psychopathic later is when something happens to their brain. They're like, remember Phil Garrido, that guy who kept the woman prisoner for a long time? He had like been thrown from a motorcycle and had a frontal brain injury and immediately became obsessed with rape and violent crime. Or the famous Phineas Gage story, the guy who had hit the tamping iron and it went into his frontal lobe and his whole personality changed. Wow. That kind of thing you could see, where there's brain damage. And but that's a whole other animal. Usually that you would see a pattern that dates all the way back. Like you would find out that the person who did this from the time they were a little kid, they were in like fights, they were running away from home, they were using drugs, they were a bully, they were exploiting people, they were, classic thing. I suspect that if he is mentally ill, I think that he is a victim of a silly kind of stereotype that the mentally ill are responsible for violent. The
Yeah.
reality is that the mentally ill are far more likely to be victims of violent crime.
Yeah.
These kinds of things are committed by personality disordered people. There are some occasional cases of like Herbert Mullen and Richard Chase and right, and I mean people that
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
completely disorganized and psychotic, delusional, operating under. But the vast majority of these people are basically personality disordered people who had horrendous childhoods and are basically infuriated or
Yeah.
feel rejected by the world and have very rich fantasy life. That is a totally different profile than what we
Right.
get a feeling of. Did I see somebody ask something about Zodiac, or am I losing my mind? Yes.
You did,
Did you
yeah.
guys see that?
I can read it for you. I saved it because I figured you'd like that one.
That's my pet case.
I know it
It's
is.
my favorite case.
What does it say about Zodiac that he wore a makeshift executioner's outfit during the only stabbing killing that he committed?
It's a good question.
They're talking about the Lake Berryessa.
Yeah.
So, okay, so they're talking about Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, right? September 27th, 1969. So they go out on a date to Lake Berryessa, this really pretty, picturesque place by the water in California. And they are basically stalked by what turns out to be Zodiac, who's hiding behind trees and kind of so forth. And he comes out wearing this rather silly, I would say, executioner hood with like a kind of a dicky that kind of goes down with a hair stitched onto it, very expertly stitched on, and gloves, boots. He's got a long sheath with a blade with studs, glasses covering the holes in this kind of potato sack like hood. It's really very bizarre, very rich fantasy being played out. And he gives this cover story that he's escaped from Montana. And, and what happened is Brian Hartnell, a student of, I think, sociology, he's trying to like get a paper out of this. He thinks they're going to be robbed and he's going to write a paper about it because he survives the killing, the killing of the other woman, of Shepard, excuse me. And so he's like, what can we do to help you? Here's my wallet, and he's like, I want your car keys. I need to flee. But this is all a ruse to get them to be comfortable. And he gets them to kind of lie down in their bellies and he pulls from behind him clothesline and he hog ties them and basically stabs them. And Hartnell, who's still alive, describes that he is basically stabbing Cecilia like in sexual area, like in the breasts and so forth. But it's like this vicious, over the top stabbing. He was stabbed in the back less times. The focus is definitely the female. And then he sort of walks off thinking that they're going to die out there. And he writes on their car, he writes a score like the police have this many victims. He says, like, I think it's by knife, by gun, by whatever. And it's like this kind of message to the police. And then he makes a phone call to the police to boast. And he says, you're going to find these kids, I'm the one who killed them, etc. What happens, of course, Brian Hartnell lives. He kind of crawls up to the road. Cecilia dies 2 days later, and he describes this ridiculous outfit Zodiac wears. Now, what's fascinating about this is that in one of the letters Zodiac wrote, he quotes the Mikado, the Gilbert and Sullivan musical. And what he quotes is the song that is sung by the executioner, where he sings, I've got a little list, I've got a little list, won't none of them be missed, right? And he lists all the people that he considers offenders in society that would be better off dead. And you get the sense of Zodiac sort of seeing himself that way, as somebody that's going to get rid of, people that he just doesn't like. And obviously women are on the list. And, so that I think the idea is it was an enactment of a fantasy of being this kind of executioner figure that was going to go out and kind of like really like the original meaning of a serial killer. It looked just like the costumes that were worn in those old serials. I think it had something to do with with the enactment of some kind of psychosexual fantasy and wanting to really kill a woman wearing that outfit. And it really tells you something about how advanced and specific. I mean, imagine this guy like sitting somewhere with a sewing machine, like sewing that Zodiac symbol on the hood and like donning it and
Like
putting the whole. I mean,
idiotic
and it's
though.
really fascinating, right? I mean,
Really silly.
that use of costume to become this figure, like, because he was probably just an ordinary kind of schlub, But
Have
then
you
when he puts
seen
that
that?
outfit on, how scary he must
What
have
a
been.
dork.
He's a dork.
Yeah, it has it's like very. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's like it reminds me of like the local kid who would like go to Comic-Con and have like cosplay
Yeah.
outfit. It's like it's like a murder outfit. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think it's interesting in terms of the fantasy element.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you say? I mean that and all that part of the fantasy is like I'm a scarier figure than I really am, and I kind of like you actually believe my nonsense story, but this is all you're just pawns in my little game here and all that.
Mhm.
But I just think it's that kind of thing. It's about wanting to be an executioner. And the key to the whole Zodiac case is I think he figured out at some point that he didn't have to actually kill anybody anymore to boast. He could kill randomly and then write letters to the police and the press and say, I killed 50 people or whatever, 37, I think he said. And then whenever there was a random killing, you would think he could have been the one. I
Yeah.
mean, that was the idea. He just wanted to boast. And that he is a decidedly modern offender for that reason, right? Ego being the motive, right? So fascinating case, but I just think, the Cecilia Shepard is definitely one of the canonical victims. That was really Zodiac. But my answer is I think that was part of the signature to play that fantasy out for him. So he needed that. It was silly, it's sort of unnecessary, except for
Mhm.
psychological reasons. So, but anyway, good thing that Brian lived, otherwise we'd never know about it. Any other questions? Anything for
Any
Anne?
other questions? Yeah.
I just want to plug Dr. Burgess and Dr. Brucato's books again. We have links in the description, I think, but we'll be sure to send those out again. You'll learn a lot.
Well, I love Anne's book. I've
Good.
read that 2 times now.
Oh,
And
geez.
one of my favorite things about it, Anne, is the use of transcript from the offenders so that you hear them
Yeah.
talking about their crime. I think that's very,
Yeah.
very important. And you
Yeah.
have that treasure of transcript that you can quote from. I think that makes it very powerful.
That makes it. I mean, you have that in your book too. I think that's what makes the mean something to people to hear. Actually, the depths that they go to, that they can say, and the way their minds are working.
One of the things I suppose the public knows it already, but I didn't know it until I read your book, was Dennis Rader, for example, started out with this obsession with Annette Funicello, the actress. I thought that was fascinating that
Yeah.
that his
Yeah.
fantasy victim was this actress, this mouseketeer, that he honed in on, and we wouldn't know that if it wasn't for like his own words, So that kind of stuff for somebody who's really into getting into the phenomenology of these people, that stuff is like a gold mine, And so I thought that was brilliant. I love that, and I love the kind of weaving of how things came together, and you guys started doing this with these case examples. It makes for really good reading. And I mean, the New Evil is like a textbook. You read it when you're like, it's like very technical, and it's not for everyone. It's like the complaint about it is that after enough pages of it, you need like 2 weeks of like petting bunnies or something before you can pick it up again, because it's too much. Our editor told us that. He was like, I've got to pet the cat like between reading it. It's just too horrendous. So especially as you climb the scale and all that.
Oh, I
But
know.
but and it's
But it's
your
important.
book is like
It's so good.
page turner. In case people don't realize it, because we didn't say it tonight, Anne was the basis for Wendy Carr on Mindhunter.
Yeah.
On the Netflix series.
Yes.
And we could probably have a whole show about why they decided to depict her so differently.
I know. Yeah. We should get them on. Have them on too, so we could talk about them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. I think you were. They made Wendy Carr gay woman.
Yeah.
She was a psychologist, not a nurse,
Professor, right?
and
And
right, a
she
professor, and
had a relationship with her supervisor, which is horrifying in academia.
That's horrifying.
well, the other thing is, and they, it's funny because Alan, your husband Alan, was one of the co-authors of the crime classification
Right,
manual.
right. Yeah,
But
he
he's
did
like
all-
chopped out of
They
the
totally-
storyline, and
Yeah,
they made the
totally
character.
took it out. I hated that. I would have been so mad.
Like, that's weird to me. Yeah. And
Yeah.
they gave the impression that you were more like down there, involved in the. It was like you were doing all this kind of technical work.
Oh yeah, they had the Hollywood. They had to Hollywood it up, so to speak. So I mean, they did the worst things for John's background and for Bob's background. I mean, poor Bob had to have a 10-year-old serial killer kid. Oh, geez.
Yeah.
Bob Wrestler, I know.
Who knew these men? That's so 180.
And why was there no Hazelwood in the show?
Hazelwood did work with rape, not serial
Right.
killers. Yeah.
So
Great group, you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Lovely.
You're welcome.
We'll share all of the resources, and thank you for your time. This was wonderful, and I'm going to be percolating on everything we've talked
Yes.
about for days and
We are
weeks.
so grateful.
Thank you, everyone.
good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.